Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Welcome again to the Right Take Podcast. I apologize for the delay since the last episode. We had some technical issues with this episode, which was actually recorded right after Halloween, and also, my wife had a baby last week. And having a baby tends to impact your time. We have 5 kids now. And as the comedian Jim Gaffigan says, you know what it's like having 5 kids? Imagine that you're drowning and someone hands you a baby. No, I'm joking. It's actually fine. It's all under control because the older kids are a big help. But having a newborn does throw a wrench into your schedule. Anyway, I'm back on track now. Thank you for joining me at the intersection of politics and culture. I know you have many podcast choices out there. Too darn many, in fact. I'm convinced there are more podcasts now than there are actual listeners, so I'm honored that you chose to give The Right Take your time and attention. My aim is to bring you really fascinating guests, and today I can promise you will not be disappointed. I'll be in conversation with my friend Raymond Ibrahim, author of several important books, but most recently of one called Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. Defenders is a sort of follow-up to Ibrahim's 2018 book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. That book was about decisive battles in the clash of civilizations, while the newer one zeroes in on the profiles of 8 decisive men in that ongoing conflict, set between the 11th and 15th centuries, from Spain's legendary hero El Cid and England's Richard Lionheart to lesser-known but no less heroic figures such as Francis Saint-Louis and Hungary's John Hunyadi. I wrote a review of it a couple of months ago for Front Page Mag and gave it 2 thumbs up, not just as a favor to a friend and a colleague at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, but because for fans of history, especially fans of military history, and fans of well-told, true-life tales of epic heroes in the Western tradition, it's a book you have to put at the top of your reading pile. But don't think that it's just a dry history lesson. It's an inspirational page-turner with contemporary resonance for our time. One of the reasons this is an important book is because historiography today, the narratives about the past, particularly our past, that of Western civilization, has been shaped almost exclusively for several decades now by the neo-Marxists who dominate our academic and cultural landscapes. Those writers and scholars and culture makers, like filmmakers, have approached history with a political agenda, determined to deconstruct and discard the glorious edifice of Western civilization. They view everything through the distorting lens of social justice ideology and multiculturalism. Multiculturalism, of course, is the worldview that all cultures are equally worthy of celebration and admiration, except Western civilization, and especially the U.S. as the ultimate representative of that culture. Western civilization is condemned by the multiculturalists as the fount of all evil and oppression and greed throughout history, and it's victimized all the other cultures, etc., etc. You know the drill. A prominent example of this anti-Western historical revisionism would be the widely criticized, but nonetheless very influential 1619 Project by New York Times propagandist Nikole Hannah-Jones. If you're a regular listener to the Right Take podcast, you may recall that in a previous episode, I addressed this with my guest Mary Graybar, an historian and the author of a couple of books debunking the left's historical hit pieces like the 1619 Project. The coordinated mission of activists like Nikole Hannah-Jones is to subvert the grand narrative of our cultural heritage in the West into an ugly tale of oppression, colonialist exploitation, and Eurocentric supremacy. Their aim is to brand all our flawed heroes as racists and hypocrites and to knock them off their pedestals, both figuratively and literally. This is one reason why the book Defenders of the West offers such a refreshing take. It unapologetically rejects that leftist worldview, so you can see how this would be so appreciated by those of us who have a deep respect and love for the Western tradition and who care deeply about preserving it for our children, and how it would be equally galling or infuriating to the enemies of the West. The forewords to both books were written by renowned historian and conservative commentator Victor Davis Hanson, whose name is no doubt familiar to you. He actually served as Ibrahim's master's thesis advisor in the late 1990s. Hansen says of the men in Ibrahim's new book, quote, "In what now may seem an archaic sensibility, they were fighting for a unique way of life, or often a restoration of it, against a rising challenge completely foreign to everything in their experience, from the aspirations voiced on the Sermon of the Mount to classical traditions of individual liberty," unquote. Ibrahim himself explains that the book is about 8 men who, quote, "driven by something greater than themselves, devoted much of their lives and went to great lengths to make a militant, if not desperate, stand against Islamic aggression," unquote. He argues that without them and many more defenders like them over the centuries, there would not have been a West to speak of today. And for the West to survive its current enemies, both foreign and domestic, we need defenders like that today, in this era of what I think I can call, without fear of contradiction, civilizational decline. The West is in decline. The United States is in decline. This is no secret to anyone who is paying attention, especially our enemies. In every arena you can name, economically, socially, morally, civically, spiritually, I don't think I need to tell you that the needle is in the red. We're in the danger zone, and our enemies smell blood. In fact, my filmmaker friend Gloria Greenfield, who makes documentaries highlighting the threats that are facing us in the Western world today, she's just finished a new one with the very appropriate title, Civilization in the Danger Zone. I'm going to have her on this podcast, by the way, to discuss that film and her other work very soon. But that doesn't mean that there isn't cause for optimism, because there is. But reversing our civilizational decline is going to require fighters, defenders, heroes driven by something greater than themselves, as Raymond Ibrahim put it. In fact, his new book is unabashedly dedicated to all the past, present, and future defenders of that which is good, right, and true. The good, the right, and the true? Gee, there are some ideals you don't hear spoken of very often in our postmodern time. So I see the historical heroes in Ibrahim's book as role models. We should aspire to their courage and selflessness, and it doesn't have to be on the same grand scale as a Richard Lionheart. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to saddle up with sword and shield, as fun as that might be. There are many ways to fight back, many ways to defend our way of life in our everyday lives and our local communities. One way is to hand down heroic tales like the ones in Ibrahim's book to our children, to the next generation, instead of instilling in them a self-loathing about our civilization and its values and achievements. That's part of the value of this book. And again, it's not just a dry history lesson. Victor Davis Hanson calls the book engaging storytelling of fascinating people and forgotten events at its best. And as a reader with a special passion for medieval history and chivalric exploits, both historical and fictional, I can promise you that Raymond Ibrahim's 2 most recent books, Sword and Scimitar and Defenders of the West, are essential and compelling reading, and that you are going to find him a compelling guest as well. So, enough of me talking about it. Let's get to Raymond and let him speak for himself. Don't go away. My guest today on the Right Take podcast is an historian and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, as I am too, which makes us fellows. Sorry, I'm easily amused. He's also a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, he's the author of several books, including, most recently, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, and the newest one, Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. Raymond Ibrahim, thanks for joining us at The Right Take.
Hello, Mark. Very good to be with you.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. Thanks for taking the time. Why don't we start off with you just kind of giving us a little bit of your background, how you entered this field, and what your what the academic background is, and all that.
Sure, Mark. So it really all starts, way back many decades when I was born, because my version of the take is it's not just a professional thing, but it's kind of a personal or private thing. It's a part of my upbringing because my family comes from Egypt. I was born here in the United States, but they immigrated here in the, I think, mid 60s. And they're what's called Coptic Christians, which is basically the indigenous Christian minority of Egypt. So growing up, obviously, I kind of had that kind of funny upbringing where I was, half the time in America, and then at home I was sort of like in a little Egypt. And I grew up bilingual, speaking Arabic, and then later I also formally studied Arabic, including classical Arabic and the various colloquial dialects. But so, my whole youth, I was obviously naturally interested in that part of the region. I had, cousins and uncles and aunts who lived there. I visited it, not just Egypt, but the broader Middle East in general. So, naturally just part of my world. And then in college, I very much was interested in history, and I gravitated naturally towards this sort of ancient Near East, whatever, from ancient pharaohs and Mesopotamians to ancient Greece and Rome. And so I really focused in that area. And I was lucky to have for a professor, Victor Davis Hanson, because I went to Fresno State in my college years. So both my bachelor's and master's were in history. And he was the chair of my thesis committee. And another Shillman Fellow, ironically, Bruce Thornton, was one of the readers on my master's committee as well. So kind of like small world here. Anyway, yeah, great guy.
He's one of my favorite writers, as is Victor Davis Hanson, of course. But I think Bruce Thornton is underrated.
Yeah, I agree with you. And great guy to know personally as well. And, to have general conversations with. So I've known both those men, for about 25 years now. Remember, we used to have parties at Victor's ranch in Selma and so forth. Bruce just recently retired, I believe. Anyway, so I went to school there, and it was a great time. Studied history, and then when I was writing my master's thesis, which I probably started around 2000, I was focused because I was working with Victor Davis Hanson, and this is his high time of military history, and I naturally enjoyed that as well. So I let my hand to writing my thesis on the first military conflict between Islam and Christendom in the guise of what we call the Byzantine Empire. And, it was also because I was studying the languages, Arabic and Greek and so forth. So it made perfect sense. It was a perfect nexus. I wrote about the Battle of Yarmouk, which is ironic. So I wrote that, came out in 2001. So we're talking 21 years ago. And it's funny to see that I'm back writing about military history again of Islam and the West or Christianity. At any rate, right when that thesis came out, it was 2001. That's when I got my master's. And that's when, of course, 9/11 happened. And so I decided to continue my studies. And I went to Georgetown University. I was accepted in one of the leading Islamic departments, or rather Arabic. It was the Contemporary Center for Arabic Studies. I went there and I studied early year. I spent some time working towards a PhD. Also, I took a break and I went to Catholic University of America because I was in Washington, D.C. at the time. I ended up getting an internship at the Library of Congress at the Near East section of the Middle Eastern and African Division. And that was a great thing for me because I'm a bibliophile. And I was in the largest library in the world, which is also a beautiful building, the Jefferson Building. And that became a full-time job. And when that became a full-time job, in many ways, it kind of, changed my academic studies because I was working 40 hours at a new job. I was recently married, had my first child, buying a home. So I couldn't really juggle everything. And I ended up quitting college, not least because I was also finally learning about how academia is. When I went to Georgetown, I had no idea about how politically charged these some of these programs were, or how it's just it's the default setting is to always be an apologist for Islam. So I definitely had I clashed with some of those people, including like John Esposito, because he's from Georgetown, and I think John Vol as well. So yeah, that's my early. So I basically quit academia, and then at the same time, I also found the writings of Al Qaeda in Arabic at the Library of Congress. So this is a lot all going on at once. The full-time job, and I got a book deal with Doubleday to translate, Al Qaeda. So I couldn't go to school, and I ended up dropping out. and that was a great decision, by the way. So I wrote the book, Al Qaeda Reader, that came out, and I was still at the Library of Congress. And right around then, it came out in 2007, even though I started working on it in 2004. But at that point, that's when I started, meeting people in this field, such as the David Horowitz Freedom Center people. I think one of my earliest talks ever was in 2006, where I spoke for the Freedom Center. And I also met with Danielle Pipes, Middle East Forum. I ended up getting a job as an associate director at the Middle East Forum, and I basically just quit the Library of Congress after, I don't know, 6-7 years I was there. And it was, like I said, it was a great job. I really miss, having access to all those books. But I still have colleagues there who can help out with Xeroxing things and whatnot. Anyway, I worked as a associate director of Middle East Forum for about a couple of years. Then I was offered various fellowships, including the Shillman Fellowship at the Horowitz Center. And I also, from being an administrator, I became a fellow at the Middle East Forum. And as you noted, the Gatestone Institute. And really, so since about 2010, my full-time job and activities have been directed towards writing articles, mostly on Islam, but especially certain niches like the persecution of Christians. And in recent years, I've sort of returned to my original interest, which is history, especially with the two books that I've written, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, which came out in 2018, and the new one, which just came out a couple of months ago, Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam.
And that your facility with languages, especially classical Arabic, that has really become a major strength for you as far as being an historian, right? Because you work mostly, you can tell from reading your books that you're working mostly from the original sources, which is just fascinating, I think.
Yeah, it definitely opens a whole world to me. It's if you're going to be focused at that's one part of academia that makes sense. You need to know the languages if you're going to really focus and delve into the world, or else you're not just limited, dramatically as to what you can access, but you also have to go by that translation. And when you talk about Islam, when you just look at the Quran, for example, and you don't even have to know Arabic, just look at the various English translations, and you're going to be wondering what's going on here because they're so wildly translated. And there's a reason for that, obviously. It's intentional, I think, but also the Arabic is naturally poetic and fuzzy and ambiguous and whatnot. But I would say knowing that language has just really opened a whole different world, and I especially enjoy listening to Arabic, Muslim sermons and debates and whatnot. Yeah, you definitely get a more accurate picture of what's going on in that area.
Interesting, because for one thing, our fundamentalist enemies tend to present one message. They often present one message in their original language to the fellow Arabic listeners, and another message in English for Western consumption.
That was the whole point of my getting into this field. Actually, was the whole translation thing with the Al Qaeda Reader, because up until the Al Qaeda Reader, before I translated these writings, you had obviously communiques from Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, which were being translated and relayed through the media, CNN, Fox News, whatever. And in those things, which were made, as you say, for Western consumption, it was all about where we attacked you because you are making our lives miserable by supporting Israel, by whatever. The list went on forever, because of colonialism, because you blaspheme and hurts our feelings, whatever. Even the Kyoto Protocol, which dealt with the environment, Osama bin Laden cited as a grievance for Muslims. But then those writings the writings that I came across, which were written in Arabic, were the complete opposite. It basically, they spelled out and said, it doesn't even matter if these Western people were good to us. We have to hate them. We have to wage war against them, because that's what our religion commands. And, Ayman Zawahiri wrote 60-page treatise on what I translate as loyalty and enmity. In Arabic, it's called al-wala wal-bara, which basically means you have to love and work with fellow Muslims, and you have to hate non-Muslims, even if they're good towards you. And the problem, of course, is this doctrine is fundamentally grounded in the Quran. There's many verses that call that. But anyway, as you say, that was, I think that was one of the most important, that was the catapult to get me into this whole world anyway, from being a librarian and an academic to being someone who's trying to convey the thoughts and words.
Well, your two most recent books are about the clash of civilizations in the Middle Ages. But that clash of civilizations is still ongoing, of course. I mean, we're now more than 20 years past the 9/11 attacks. And there's a whole, I think that's starting to gradually fade in people's consciousness. And then we have a whole generation of people who have been born since those attacks who are probably largely unaware of what's going on. But that clash of civilizations is still ongoing, isn't it?
Yeah, and that was the whole point. I was trying to show that there's some continuity. There's a method to this, Muslim madness as it's seen. It's not some new aberration, because that's how it's presented. Of course, it's presented in a vacuum. That Islamic terrorism, or whatever you want to call it, Muslim radicalism, Muslim anger, whatever. It's not something new that just happened because of this or that grievance. I mean, that's the mainstream narrative still until this day. That it's actually something that is religious and that's been going on since the beginning of Islam, literally from the time of Muhammad. He was the first one who actually began hostilities with the powers that surrounded him. In the case of the West, the Byzantine Empire, where he sent a missive, a letter to the Emperor Heracles, basically telling him convert or else. And obviously the Christians didn't. And that just opened a can of worms of jihad that went on century after century after century. And that's the topic of my 2018 book, Sword and Scimitar, is just to show you that it's been nothing but war and violence and hostility from Islam vis-a-vis the West from the very beginning, 7th century, all the way until the modern era. And the reason it's interesting to me, if you ever talk to a historian or basically the apologist types when it comes to Islam, they almost any book, any documentary, everything begins with the colonial era, okay? As if there was nothing before that. And the reason for that is the colonial era in the 1800s, let's say, and onwards. Islam was remarkably weak against the West, and the West was remarkably strong, okay? So it features Westerners entering Islamic lands and colonizing them and so forth. And, what they don't tell you is the 12 centuries before that, when it wasn't like that, when actually Islam was strong and Europe was on the, defense. And all it was, Muslims invading and conquering Christian land. And people forget North Africa, all of it, from Morocco to Egypt, Middle East, Syria, Greater Syria, modern day Israel, Turkey. All these were the heart of the Christian world in the 7th century when Islam erupted. And today we just casually think of them as just Muslim territory, which of course it is, but it was taken through violent conquest. And if you look at a map, that means Islam literally conquered 3/4 of what was the original Christian world through violence and force. Again, people forget about Spain, centuries conquered, and you have almost about 800 years of Reconquista until it's finally, Islam is neutralized as a political power in 1492 and so forth. And then after that, it starts again in the East with the Ottomans, who again, and it's important to underscore and emphasize while I'm discussing this history, that it's one thing to say that Muslims and Christians fought. Okay, Ottomans fought against the Habsburgs or whatever. Moors fought against, Castile. This is how the historians talk, and there's nothing wrong with it intrinsically. But what it does is it distances the motive and the religion, because when you dig into the sources, you find out that the Muslims, century after century, whether they were Arabs or Moors or Turks or Tatars, basically Islamic Muslims, they all spoke like the Islamic State. They all said that we hate you to, whatever Christian they were, just or non-Christian, Jew or Hindu, whatever. But I'm mostly talking about the West, that, we hate you because you're an infidel. You have 3 choices: convert, or become a second-class citizen, essentially, pay tribute and live basically like a slave in many instances, for example, or fight to the death. They actually said that in all the sources. And yet that's been sort of expunged in secondary histories. And you just think to yourself, okay, clashing empires, nothing surprising. There's no ideological component. But there really was. There was the same ISIS mentality, same ideological component. And And, I left off with the Ottomans, and they just swallowed up the Balkans, mass terror. The word Slav comes from slave, because basically to be a Slav in those days was to be a slave. The sources talk about anything from 10 to 15 million Europeans being enslaved. We all know, of course, of the transatlantic slave. We don't slave trade. We don't know, of course, about Europeans being enslaved. Muslims going all the way up to Iceland, to bring slaves, because there was a premium on white slaves, for example. And this goes on until 1683 with the siege of Vienna, and which features the largest Muslim army, something like 200,000 jihadists encircling Vienna and Austria, and so forth. So look at that, from 637 or 636, the first battle. I talk about the Battle of Yarmouk, which I studied in college and wrote my thesis about. And you fast forward to 1683, that's a millennium, and it's all jihadist conquest. And then even the United States, its first war as a nation, which begins a little before 1800, after its independence from Britain, is with Muslims, again, acting on the same jihadist imperative. Barbary, basically, North Africa, which were pirates, and they were attacking and enslaving American vessels, and killing them and wanting jizya, tribute. And when Thomas Jefferson and Adams met with the ambassador, and they said, "Why are you attacking us? We everyone's our friend. We are happy to work with you, trade with you, whatever." He basically said, "Well, it's our religion and our prophet and our holy book command us to kill you, enslave you, etc., etc." So I think the important point from all this is to understand that whatever hostilities there are between Muslims and non-Muslims, it is not a byproduct of some new circumstance, some new grievance. This is the religion.
I'd like to zero in on one of the subjects of your most recent book, Defenders of the West. We just passed Halloween, and so I think it's appropriate that we talk about an article that you wrote recently for thestream.org called, which I think is the great title, Count Dracula, Undead Bloodsucker or Anti-Jihad Hero. And of course, we're talking about Vlad the Impaler, the historical figure on whom the fictional monster Dracula is based. I suspect a lot of our conservative listeners know something about this historical connection. They know a little bit about Vlad the Impaler, but tell us a little bit about the historically correct, or the actual historical background and truth about Vlad.
Sure, Mark. So, yeah, as you say, it's very apropos for the Halloween season that just passed. So Count Dracula, of course, we know him. I think through it's a novel in 1897 by Bram Stoker, which is an undead bloodsucker vampire from Romania, and it follows his exploits essentially. Now, as a lot of novelists do, they try to find some historical setting or names to give some realism to their story. So he found a name, Vlad III Dracula. Dracula actually is his epithet, and what it means is son of the dragon, because his father Vlad II Dracul was in the Order of the Dragon, which was a Christian Hungarian order designed to protect Christendom from Islam. At any rate, so Vlad, he found him, and basically he looked at some of the writings about him from his era. So we do have early writings that deal with Vlad III, who we're talking about, Count Dracula, and they definitely don't portray him as a good guy. He's a sadist. He tortures. He impales. Till today, he's really known as as Vlad the Impaler in translation, Tsepish in Romanian, and of course he's of Romanian stock, or Wallachia at the time, and so he was a sadist who impaled people. We know that. But the descriptions are really lurid and extreme, and the stuff that he supposedly did, just very diabolical. Okay. Evil guy. Now, and he took that and turned it into a fictitious bloodsucker and so forth. Now, the truth about it is, if you really dig into it, those are early references that depict him that way. But most historians will tell you that that's because, the Gutenberg press had just come out. And he had fallen afoul of the king of Hungary, And, the Pope wanted to know why the King of Hungary wasn't helping in Vlad's crusade against the Turks because they gave him money. At any rate, long story short, they demonized him and actually put him in jail at that point and said he was a maniac and that he was doing all that stuff. Now, the historical, more accurate account that, again, most modern historians, I think, would agree with. So the main point to keep in mind is that, yes, he did engage in terror tactics and he did impale, but one, he learned those from his Ottoman captors who kept him in jail. And two, he was always vastly outnumbered. He could never really wage a proper conventional war because he was always something like 1-10 or 1-20 against the Ottomans. And his men were, very poorly equipped. So he had to resort to sort of these terror tactics, ambush, guerrilla warfare, and it actually worked. He actually repelled the Ottomans and he terrified them, including Sultan Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople a decade earlier.
Yeah. Obviously, most people know of Dracula through legends and the movies, but there is a movie from 2014, although I think Netflix recently acquired it because it popped up there and I watched it again recently. It's called Dracula Untold, which I think, as far as I know, seems to be the most historically correct Dracula movie. It tries to give some actual historical fact to the more horror flick element. What do you think about that movie in terms of its attempt to depict Vlad historically truly?
I remember thinking the same thing that you said. I did watch it some years back, so I don't fully remember, but I do recall thinking, wow, this is actually somewhat accurate. They do portray him basically as an embattled, Wallachian warlord who's being attacked by the Ottomans, and the Hungarians aren't helping him often. And he just, and he himself, the thing is, he himself suffered so much and was tortured and kept in jail by both Christians and Muslims. He actually spent more time in jail than on the throne. So it kind of gives you an insight on why he was possibly sadistic, because that's what he grew up with. That's what he understood. But yeah, the movie, I think, of all the movies out there would be the most closest to the most accurate, even though I think they also underplay the Islamic element as usual. But yeah, but what I found interesting about him is this whole business about, fake news Dracula, and it's kind of not unlike what happens today. So to me, this is an example of not fake news but fake history, and there's a lot of that, and it really excels on basically it with what it does to religion. So what it does in this case is it takes Islam out of the equation. Okay, Islam didn't do anything bad. It didn't have a negative impact on Dracula or whatever. And then it also takes out the Christian element. So Vlad was actually a very staunch Christian of the Orthodox variety, Eastern Orthodox. And, a few people know that. We all think of him as demonic. And in his letters and correspondences, he always portrayed his defense of his land against the Turks in very, Christian terms, that he was defending Christendom. He was trying to help Christendom against Islam and jihad and so forth. He always would hang out in monasteries. He actually supported Mount Athos and so forth. So again, Hollywood, while deleting the Islamic element, they also delete the Christian element or try to show it as being behind his cruelty. So we're all familiar with medieval Hollywood depictions where the worst guy, the most hypocritical guy, the most evil sadist is the Christian guy holding the cross, right? So yeah, so I think those elements are sort of alive and well in Hollywood depictions of Dracula, and like I said, it's fake history, the counterpart of fake news.
There's a lot more about Vlad in your new book, Defenders of the West. Let's talk about some of the other historical characters in it. Some of whom are very well known, of course, Richard the Lionheart, for example, Vlad, whom we talked about, El Cid from Spain. There are a few that are lesser known popularly, like the Albanian Skanderbeg, who you describe, or his nickname is the Albanian Braveheart, which is a pretty fascinating chapter. Is there a favorite character that you have in here, a favorite chapter Is there one of yesterday's heroes in here that you kind of have a secret, or not secret, but a personal preference for?
To be honest with you, I don't. I like them all, and that's why I picked these 8 guys. And I thought it was a good a good spread because it's 8 chapters. 2 of them are Spaniards dealing with the Reconquista, and 3 of them are Crusaders dealing with the liberation of the Holy Land. And 3 are from the Balkans, Vlad being one of them. I think I've had a lot of people read it and comment, and I find it interesting that there isn't one particular character that everyone likes, which is good. I think each story has different elements that resonate differently with different readers, which is, I think, a good thing. I think probably the one who is the most interesting as a story, and probably the one who's also the least known, is Skanderbeg, who you referenced, the Albanian Braveheart, because this story is very remarkable. And without giving too many spoilers, basically he's enslaved just like Vlad. He's a little before Vlad. In fact, they were contemporaries, but he's older. But he was enslaved and became a janissary, which is an Islamic soldier, slave soldier, where they would take basically the strongest Christians, the smartest, whatever, the ones that showed, great skills, and force them into Islam as children, okay, as young as 9, sometimes younger, and train them basically like Spartans in the Goge. They would just train them to become brutal warriors. And that's what he was. So he and his brothers were taken, I think 4 of his brothers, and he was the youngest, and the 4 died from Ottoman treatment. But not only did he survive, he became a great captain and a general, and the Sultan loved him because he was a great warrior, and he had 5,000 men under him. But it's funny because once the chance came to break free, he did, and he is absconded from the Ottoman army and went back to Albania and reclaimed his Christian identity. He recanted Islam and Muhammad, and as you can imagine, that just caused jihad after jihad to be sent towards little Albania. And in long story short, he actually persevered for a quarter of a century, and in every engagement, he beat the Ottomans. And it's just amazing. And that's why I say that he's known as the Albanian Braveheart. It's a very similar story to William Wallace in Scotland and whatnot, where he just, wages guerrilla warfare against a much stronger army and continuously defies them until the very end, of course. And that's, readers can look into that. And I don't want to ruin it, but a very exciting story. All these stories, but especially this one, you wonder to yourself, Hollywood could make any, awesome movie just on one of these chapters, like Skanderbeg, and they just don't touch him, with a 9-foot pole. And I think it's for the reasons I mentioned earlier. 1, because it depicts Islam negatively, and 2, because it sort of is very pro-Christian. Skanderbeg and all these men, again, they always presented their war and resistance against Islam as in the name of Christianity. So it's like a double no-no, exactly. I think, for Hollywood.
Yeah. I too am kind of frustrated that Hollywood doesn't latch onto these stories, but at the same time, I'm kind of grateful that they don't, because I know what Hollywood's going to do with them. They'll ruin these stories like they ruined
the Rings of Power,
or Kingdom of Heaven. Remember that Crusades film?
Right.
Gosh.
Oh yeah.
So I guess it's it's a blessing in a way.
It's probably a good thing. Yeah. I agree.
But they are great stories, and I'm a big fan. One of the reasons I love these, especially your 2 most recent books, is I'm a big fan of military history too, especially the Middle Ages. That the medieval era is really kind of my jam, as young people used to say, probably a couple of generations ago. I love this stuff, but I confess that I knew next to nothing about Skanderbeg, for example. So there's a lot. For even someone like me, who's pretty familiar with this material, there was a lot in here that in your books that I was unaware of, and I found it just really fascinating and well told. Also, great storytelling. You write in the book, I wanted to bring out one quote in particular. You write, quote, that every one of them, meaning every one of the characters that you've written about, was the living embodiment of what is today condemned as toxic masculinity and the patriarchy. Worse, not only were they all white, male, and Christian, but far from being ashamed or apologetic over these now troubling attributes, two of these identity markers, their masculinity and religious faith, are precisely what animated them to act, unquote. Let's talk about those two markers, their masculinity and their faith. As you mentioned, masculinity today is considered toxic and obsolete. People of faith are also in decline in the West. What are the implications and the consequences of those qualities lacking in Western civilization today?
Well, I think we're seeing it every day, Mark, especially in the West. As one example, Islam tried to invade, let's say, Europe proper time and time again, as these books show. And these men that I talk about, and others, of course, resisted through arms, they definitely had to have a masculine spirit, because they threw themselves in war, like I said, often in very outnumbered situations, desperate situations, but they did it because they had something to fight for, their civilization, their faith, their families, their culture. Today you look at, let's say, Europe, in some places it's literally overrun by Muslims. And these aren't Muslims who are grateful. I mean, they come there, and in a lot of areas they have these enclaves, and the cops are afraid to enter because they might get killed. And it's just a repeat of what happened before, except now Western forces, far from doing anything, they're going out of their way to facilitate this sort of thing. And it's precisely because these two markers, their faith and their masculinity, which are important. The one, masculinity, of course, allows the man to be assertive, protective of his own, and the faith gives them something to fight for, some actual thing to preserve. But I think today there's nothing to fight for, because everyone's a materialist, and it's all about, as long as you're enjoying your hedonistic lifestyle, who cares what anyone's doing? And of course, as we've seen, the masculinity, it's one of the worst things. It's being, it's the way to go is to be emasculated, and if you're not, then there's something wrong with you, obviously. And then obviously that attack is by design. It's unfortunate more men don't understand that it's not because being masculine is not cool. It's because the powers that be that want to control you know that the first thing they ever have to do is castrate men. I mean, that's the easiest thing you can do to beat an enemy. You just get rid of the men. And that's what we're seeing, this idea of trying to present women as warriors, and wherever you look, women are strong and dominant and men are just weak and silly. I think that's all by design, precisely to emasculate men, because with emasculated men you can do anything you want. There's no resistance. And I think that's what we're seeing everywhere in the West.
An emasculated civilization that's populated by people who are basically taught to hate their own cultural heritage, and who have no sense of something greater than themselves to fight and die for. That's kind of a bleak description, I'm afraid, of today's Western civilization. Does that, are you optimistic or pessimistic in light of all that about the clash of civilizations and the future of the West?
I'm pessimistic in the sense that I think it has to get worse before it gets better, because it's already gotten so bad. And when you see, I'll give you one example, and I've had a lot of people tell me this. Say what you want about Islamists and radical Muslims, but when you put LGBT stuff in front of their kids and trans, you saw what they did in Dearborn. I mean, they really got angry, they got vocal, and a lot of people told me, why aren't Christians or conservatives doing that? I'd like to see that too, because it's like enough. Too many Western men, especially, have been taught that they just have to be passive. If you're not passive, if you take a stand for anything, then you're kind of a weirdo, and you're not cool, and you're not hip. And it's that's just how everyone is taught. And then they just run shot over everyone with insanity and all these crazy leftist and sexually perverse things that they're doing. And you need to take it and be quiet, or else you're full of toxic masculinity. That seems to be the idea. And I'm pessimistic, because especially when you look at Europe, and especially Western Europe. Eastern Europe, I think, is not so bad, but Western Europe, I don't even think they understand what it means to be a man. I think everyone understands what a male and female is, even though that is under contention too. but men and women, the meaning, the connotation behind those more abstract terms, I think, are very much lacking.
Yeah, I don't know. You and I aren't biologists, Raymond, so I don't think we're allowed to define what masculine and feminine are. But you're right about all that, and I think it's been very eye-opening to see Muslims sort of take the lead against some of this LGBT agenda in Dearborn, for example. And I think you're right. There's a lesson there for the Christian community and Christian families that Christian men need to stand up and be as forceful in their defense of their own beliefs and of our cultural heritage. Speaking of standing up, I wanted to mention that you actually dedicate the book, Defenders of the West, to all the past, present, and future defenders of that which is good, right, and true. Amen to that. But isn't standing up for the good, the right, and the true kind of an obsolete statement in our postmodern, post-Christian era?
It is, and that's precisely why I wrote it. Because I know that's not how people talk, but I think that's the whole point of dedicating it to people who stand for what is good, right, and true is to acknowledge that there is good, there is as opposed to bad, there is right as opposed to wrong, and there is things that are true as opposed to things that are false. And I think all those three things are under war right now, especially under the umbrella term of relativism. Because the idea that it's all your take, and it's existentialism and whatnot, everything's subjective. I think that's a great poison, and that's one of the chief reasons that men and women are not able to take a stand for anything, because who are you to define what's good, right, and true? I mean, that seems to be the take. But in including it, I just wanted to emphasize that there is those things, or at least certainly I believe in it, but I know there's a lot of other people too.
Yeah, I think there's I think a groundswell is developing. Like you, I'm largely pessimistic, or maybe I'm just realistic. I'm not sure. I know it's going to be an uphill battle. I think you're absolutely right when you say it's going to get worse before it gets better, because I think that's what it's going to take for a lot of defenders, the future defenders of the West, to wake up and get their act together. Defenders of the West, the Christian heroes who stood against Islam, it's a gripping, exciting read. But maybe more importantly, it's inspirational at a time when I think our civilization needs real heroes and defenders. So thanks for writing that book. Please keep up the great work, and I'm looking forward to the next one from you. What is next on the agenda for you?
I'm not sure. I'm evaluating different topics. It's probably going to deal again with Islam and history, because I think that's a very fertile field that hasn't been adequately treated, at least not from people from our side. It's being dominated mostly by leftist academics, and the whole point is I'm trying to put these correctives out there, because if you don't get history right, then you can't. It's if the first premise is flawed, your conclusion will always be flawed. So you got to get the very first early things right, and then be able to build on top of those in order to understand where we are and how we got here.
Right, flawed, or we could even say intentionally.
Exactly.
Intentionally manipulated or revised. Historical revisionism at its worst. Yeah, thanks for these correctives. That's a great way to put it, that your books, I think, are historical correctives against the narrative that just absolutely dominates our academic arena and the cultural setting as well. So I think the work you're doing is just incredibly important and inspirational, as I said. So once again, Raymond Ibrahim, thanks for coming on the Right Take podcast. Hope to have you back soon.
Thanks very much, Mark.
The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.